So we take a look, and you can set this market watch up to be whatever you want it to be. I always leave mine on 7 days residential activity for the entire MLS. And you can see that we're still adding quite a few listings. This number of activity is up really quite a bit over what it was prior to the arrival of our friend Ian. So we're still seeing some fairly robust listing activity. Sales still up at close to 600. Pendings close to 650. Price decreases still significant. Now remember, you can go into any one of these. First of all, you can customize this to be just single family homes or just an area of your focus. But it's important, I think, to always stay abreast of the of the market and know, if somebody says, "Hey, Jeff, what's happening in the market?" You can say, "Well, you know what? The market is still pretty active. There's more activity going on now than there was pre-Ian. We're not sure exactly what all that is, but it could be listings that are coming on the market for people that don't want to rebuild, got their insurance money or whatever they have, and they're ready to go on the market." And we talked about how you can go in and look in a wildcard search for damaged properties, flooded properties. And I believe just recently they added a couple of categories into your search that'll excuse me, allow you to search for properties that are, let's see where they put that. I think they added a couple categories. Here we are. See over here in the status type in the lower right, you can now search for known damage. And you can search for land value. These are residential properties that are being sold for land value. You can look them up, and here they are. We can take a look at there's a Gulf Harbor property. And you can see that this has got 650,000. It's being sold for land value. A little more aerial information about the property. Gulf access, west of 41. So we know this property is damaged. Property being sold for lot value owners. Structure was flooded during Hurricane Ian. No entrance is allowed at any time to the building. Do not enter the home. Caution must be used when walking the property as unknown hazards may exist. Okay, so this is a listing that's been spawned by Hurricane Ian. And every one of these on here is under the lot value column. Here's a nice property on Vanderbilt Beach, showing a brand new dock. New seawall. And then down here in the confidential remarks, do not walk the property without listing agent. Access the interior will not be allowed. NABOR as is contract, cash offers only. So this is a way for you to search if you have an investor that is now these searches are not bringing up the amount of information that we get when we go in to look at, we just take a look at active and we go into our property description, property information, and we do a wildcard search for I see I have 160 that have the word damaged in there. And again, these are still some pretty substantial properties, and they'll talk about being damaged. If you use the word damage without the D, sometimes you'll get properties that say no damage. But rehab is subject to FEMA's 50% rule and town approval. So you can see that you can go in there and you can start taking a look at hold harmless required, do not go on property without texting. Hold harmless must be signed by buyer. So you can see that this is the market reacting to what's happened in Hurricane Ian. If you have investors that are interested in looking at these properties, there you go. So you now know, and you can search for flooded, damaged, flooded. You can search for both. So this is a way for you to take advantage of the information in MLS. Obviously, we have a lot more listings out there than we had pre-hurricane. So a lot of these are going to be properties that people want to sell, and they don't necessarily want to rebuild. So there you go. Again, InfoSparks is also part of the main page. You can go in and take a look at any one of a number of variables. Again, tailor it to your market, your geo area, and you can produce some really nice looking graphs and charts that you can share with your customers. All right. So let's take a look, quick run through the stats that we published last week. And let's see what we can do here. So we'll start with Collier County. Again, we're comparing November of 22 over November 21. It was noted in discussion that as we started into the end of 22, we didn't have the raging results that we had in the first 7 or 8 or 10 months of 2022. So we're now starting to compare 2021 to 2022. Even though 2022 was not as good at the end of the year, we're still seeing some significant comparisons to what's happening in the last quarter of 2022. So you can see that median prices continue to increase. There's just very little sales activity in the lower end of the market, both availability and sales activity. You can see new listings are slightly down over last year, but look at pendings and look at sales. Okay, so we're starting to see even lower results than the end of 2022. So it's still not a great picture of the market for November. And our forward look pendings is down 34%. So it's going to be a challenging time in the market. The good news, I guess, is that inventory is increasing relative to last year. And of course, part of that is the fact that we don't have as many sales. So the fact that inventory is increasing is a function of new listings coming on the market, some from the hurricane, some just as the sellers want or need to sell. But we're also not absorbing those sales at the rate that we were obviously a year ago or even 6 months ago. So I've added to this month's chart, I've now added the absorption rate for each style of house. Okay, so the absorption rate is an inverse calculation to the month's supply, where we divide the total number of sales for the month into the total number of active listings. And at 21%, that means that 1 in 5 listings are being absorbed by the market every month. So we're trying to give you a little different slice on the market that you can maybe talk a little bit more plainly with your customer about it, because 2.9 months supply is still half of a balanced market, which is considered 6 months. So even though it's up 2.9 to up 100, almost double, we're still not anywhere near a balanced market. And absorption is, we'll see it on the graph here in a couple of minutes. Look at the absorption rate for single family homes in Collier, down under 20%. So we're starting to see the effects of more listings coming on the market and less sales. Condos up to 28%. That's getting closer to 1 in 3 being absorbed into the market per the month. Mark, you like that added addition of the absorption stat? Trying to add value.
Definitely.
And I think this is an easier stat to talk about, excuse me, than month supply. Still have the remnants of a cold that somebody was kind enough to give me last week, but I'll make it through here. So, all right, so let's take a look then at the chart data for Collier. I'm going to bring this up a little bit. Can you see that okay, or did I need to reshare? Let me just make sure I'm sharing the right one here. Share screen. Let me get share here to the right one. Show all windows. There we go. There we go. All right. You see that okay? Yes?
Yes.
Thank you. That's the audience participation part. Okay, so this is a pretty interesting graph because the dark green bars show sales. The light green bars show properties available for sale. And look how going even through April of 22, we still started to, where we're showing in March and April, still a pretty good consumption of what was available for sale. Starting in April, we started to see more new listings available for sale, and we started to see sales declining. Ditto for new listings coming on the market, and also ditto for pendings, which is our forward look as to what's going to happen in the next 60 days, 60 to 75 days. So you can see that the shift is on. So what does this mean for a buyer? And what does this mean for a seller? Obviously, for a seller, the market that you buy in is the market that you sell in, and the market you sell in is the market you buy in. So for the seller that says to you, I wish I could have got, I wish I would have sold last March or April, I could have got a lot more. That may be true, not a lot more, but some more. But what about if their motivation is they want to buy a smaller place or a larger place, they're going to see the savings on the other end of that. The biggest problem I see is people that are sitting with a 2.5% or 3% mortgage that want to move, but like, now I got to get a 6% mortgage. It was 6.3, I think, was the rate we saw at the end of last week. So obviously, this is creating some seller reluctance, because do they want to sell into a market that's has double the market rate? So we saw last month that in Naples, 63% of the sales were cash. So obviously, the cash investors still have a little bit of leverage here because they're not facing high mortgage rates. They're seeing, what are my cash on cash returns? And obviously, they're active in the market because they still see value in the market. All right. Let's look at let's see. We'll look at our Collier month supply chart showing the change in the month's supply, which is kind of the reaction to what we just saw with those light green bars. We're up in this particular case, based on closed sales, we're up to 4 months. The other calculations are based on the active listings and pendings. So according to this in Collier, we're getting more close to a balanced market based on sales. And the median price, you can see kind of peaked out here, but it really hasn't changed a great deal. It's dropped down a little bit, but because of the product mix, we're still seeing similar or slightly higher median prices, median being the middle price. And on a lower number of sales, obviously that median can float a little bit more. And I'm going to do my last Collier chart here. This, I think, is pretty dramatic. You're going back here to March, not that long ago, when we saw absorptions close to 100%. And look at how they've dropped all the way down to just under 22%. This is all residential properties from 100% in March. That's a pretty dramatic change in the rate at which properties are being absorbed into the market. Okay, and again, we reflected that by showing you the absorption rate on your monthly graphic chart. Now let's take a look at Lee County here. Okay, so Lee County, not quite as big of a change in the median price, right? Notice days on market are up 70%. Remember that number for a long time, 2016, 17, 18, even into 19, that number was 80 to 90 days. So even though we're up 70%, we still have a reasonable turn rate of about a month. Listings down slightly, pendings down not quite as much, but sales still down dramatically over this time last year, which again, we saw a trend downward a little bit in the end of 22. So we're seeing sales down quite a bit, forward look down, and here we go. Look at the absorption rate in Lee County, much higher. Inventory up, but look at the absorption rate for condos. Still pretty good, still better than 1 and 3. All right. We'll take a quick look at the other similar charts for Lee County. I think this is a little bit more dramatic in terms of the buildup from, looks like around 2,000 properties available for sale in April to over 4,000. So the inventory clearly has doubled, but look at the sales has gone down. So part of this inventory increase is not just new properties coming on the market, it is lower sales and inventory being added. So we have a dramatic increase in the availability. And, you know, going back a little bit to one thing I wanted to point out, look at the average list to sell. It's even more, a little more dramatic in Collier. This number was 100, 101, 102 for a long time. Now it's dropped down. What does that tell you? That all this activity, decreasing sales, increasing supply, has created a little pressure on list prices. The other thing that I see quite a bit of is looking at the contracts, is I see quite a bit of seller concessions. So maybe we're not seeing the big difference in list to sell. Maybe the list and sell price are still close, but the seller's giving $10,000 to the buyer at closing, or they're giving money to buy the rate down on their mortgage. So I would say the market overall is a little softer than it was a year ago, and sellers are giving concessions to buyers to help them buy. So there's a little more incentive in the market if you've got a buyer that's telling you, oh, I'm going to wait for the prices to go down. I don't see that happening too much. Supply is still very limited. Prices are holding, but there is room for negotiation where a buyer goes in and says specifically, I'd like money toward my closing costs, or I'd like money to buy my rate down. So I see that happening, and it's reflected in these numbers here. Let's take a look at. Oh, my button's going here. Again, look at the raise in the month supply, and in Lee, we're actually seeing a little downturn in the median price. You see we're at 3.5 months supply overall based on closed sales. And look at the trend line down from the peak in April, the median price. And the last one here. Let's see if I'm doing this right here. We got share. And share Lee absorption. There we go. Okay. Hopefully you can see that okay. Again, look at the dramatic change. This was actually absorption above 100, meaning more properties were being consumed than were being, there was more closed sale activity than available inventory. Dramatic difference now as we started to see sales falling. One of the other things I'd throw in here is we had a very accentuated summer season. We obviously always have had a seasonality factor when people head north. But this year, I think we had a question of people not being able to travel since 2019. And so this summer was a very heavy travel in Europe and all over the country because people were able and felt comfortable jumping on a plane and going and see family, which they maybe haven't seen for 2 years. So we did see an accentuated summer season. Excuse me. But it's now flattened out quite a bit. Maybe we've at least seen the bottom or approaching a bottom. That's one of the things that we kind of see happening. Obviously, mortgage rates are trending down a little bit, down to 6.3. They were up over 7 a month ago. So we're starting to see inflation come down a little bit. The Fed will probably overcook the interest rates, possibly a small recession. But at any rate, maybe you can see a little bottoming going on here. Too early to tell, but the graph is starting to show you on absorption that things are starting to flatten out a little bit here. Forecast for next year. I was just in a broker meeting this morning with some of the major brokers in town, and many of them are forecasting a lower volume year next year than this year. So there's still fears of recession, high interest rates, slowing sales. So what am I trying to say here? We see conditions in the market improving a little bit, but we still see a tough year ahead. Obviously, just look at the difference in the last 6 months. So will this flatten out and we'll have a moderate year in 2023? Everybody's, I think, predicting the first part of 23, while we're still going through Fed rate increases, still inflation, still a factor, mortgage rates still significant, still seeing some downward pressure on the real estate market unit sales. price is holding because we still don't have a lot of supply, but pressure on units. So this is a time to dig in. You know, this is a time to double down on your calls to your database. This is a time to double down on your calls and your actions to try to maintain your forecast for next year. But knowing that the major brokers in town that I just sat with earlier today are looking at about a 20% decline in 23 over 22. So, and the first part of 22 was actually pretty good. So anyhow, just please take this message and these stats and put it into your business plan and work harder to stay in touch with your database. Obviously, there's still going to be between around 4.5 million transactions next year. So people are still going to buy and sell. Investors, I think, are going to be active in the market with some of the Hurricane Ian properties, and with the fact that cash on cash prices are still holding, still see some appreciation. But obviously the mortgage market is going to be challenging, and we're not going to see 2% mortgages again anytime soon, according to the forecasting from the mortgage investors. So any questions or comments regarding the economic picture or the market stats?
No, thanks for sharing them, Jeff.
All right. Well, I just want to make sure that, you know, you have to live in the market that you're in. Clearly, these graphs have shown you that we've shifted, and it's going to be relatively easier for you in a skill-based market with our tools and techniques and all the things we're offering you, maybe to pick up a little bit of market share. Double down on your referrals. Make sure that you're reaching out to any possible referrals. People are still wanting to move to Naples. That's clear by the fact that there's still quite a bit of demand, even though the total unit sales is dropping. We're still seeing, you know, quite a bit of demand. Well, just that's kind of my market update. I'm happy if you want to drill down into a neighborhood, or you're looking at a CMA and you want a little bit of insight, I'm happy to try to be what I can. Okay, so contract wise today, we're talking about contract to close. And the minute I think of contract to close, I think of one document here that is one of my favorites. I'm going to share that with you. I'm going to make it a little smaller so you can read it. So in the NABOR contract, by the way, all of the contracts were new. They were released December 1st, and they're in the library. There have been a number of classes offered, still I think maybe one or two more on the changes. I've done a couple of sessions on the changes to the contracts and what was accentuated in terms of new language and new features in the contract. But this is a timeline of events that's based on the new version of the contract. And I encourage you to use this once you've completed a transaction. You've got a closing now. You got a meeting of the minds. A few things to remember. Always calendar the major dates. Obviously, there's some items in here that are not going to be germane to your contract, but always calendar the major dates. If you're using a transaction coordinator, which is could give you a great deal of leverage in terms of all the time and paperwork it takes, you and your transaction coordinator need to line up and make sure that these key dates are in your calendar also. So if it's a deposit date or an inspection date or the end of an inspection period, make sure you have a good handle on those dates, because as you know, even though in the NABOR contract, there's a little bit of flexibility and that the closing date is the only time in the essence date, there still needs to be an adherence to these timetables. And you still want to make sure that you are out ahead of your buyer or seller and making sure they know where they stand in the transaction. The smooth execution of a contract to close cycle is one of the best ways that you can show how much you care for your customer and build a solid relationship for future transactions and referrals. I keep reminding you that we have no 401k or pension plan. We have the continued relationships with our good customers that bring us additional business as their housing needs change, and also refer you to people that are friends of theirs that can help. So this is the document in a nutshell here. You can see where it says buyer, obviously buyer, listing licensee, that being the listing agent, seller, buyer, buyer, buyer. When it's all three, closing agent and seller, closing agent and buyer. So you have but I usually like to take this and fill it out and put the due dates in. I wish we could give you a little more space, but generally you can get due dates in here and you can distribute this to your buyer or seller. So they have an idea of all the things that have to go on between contract and close. So now congratulations, you've got the contract. Now you have to navigate all of the possible concerns that you might have on the way to the closing table. And as it goes without saying that the only way we make a living and move forward is to get to the closing table. So here's a list of things that we need to focus. Obviously, still the majority of contracts that I see coming through, especially in Lee County, are as-is contracts. I see a lessening of as-is contracts in Collier County and more standard contracts. But remember, if you've got an as-is contract, you've got a due diligence period. And I see many of these due diligence periods being bargained down to 7 days, 5 days. No, that's really not a lot of time for your buyer to check the home out and make sure it's what they want. Clearly, it's not enough time to do a municipal lien search and see if there's open and expired permits or any outstanding liens on the property. That generally happens after your due diligence. So make sure, I think I've pretty much given all of you the language that you need to put into your contract that basically says that the seller will cooperate and close open permits, deal with any outstanding liens, because that's not covered as part of an as-is contract. So if you need that language, I'm happy to send it to you. I think I've put it out there many times, but basically it's just a very simple sentence that says that the seller will close all open permits, liens, and code violations prior to closing. That is not a guarantee of the as-is contract. So make sure you include that in your terms and conditions for as-is contracts. That being off the subject here, let's take a look at some of these dates. First of all, again, if you have an as-is contract, you have this is set up to be the time period of a normal contract and the flow of a standard contract. But if you have an as-is contract, obviously you still have your deposit dates, but you really have a deadline of due diligence. And remember, there's no guarantee of the seller wanting to address defective items in an as-is contract. You bargain really to take the property as is, and there's very few as-is contracts that go through as is. Most of them are as is except. So their buyer is wanting the seller to repair some items or give them credits or reduce the selling price in order to accommodate what they've learned in the due diligence period. But remember, in that scenario, if you want the seller to give you any type of adjustments or concessions or repairs, you've got to send over an amendment to the contract, and the seller has to agree to that and send it back to you prior to the expiration of your due diligence period. If the seller doesn't respond, or doesn't respond by your end of due diligence date, then the buyer has a choice to make. The buyer has to say, okay, none of this stuff is that big a deal to me. I'll take the property the way it is. Or they have to say, look, I'm gonna have to cancel because I don't have a good warm fuzzy feeling that the seller is going to address my concerns. But that's a huge date in the contract, because it can mean the difference between your buyer being able to walk away or your buyer being deemed to have accepted the property in the condition that it was in. So be careful with that due diligence date if you're on an as-is contract. In the normal contract, obviously we have a buyer's inspection period, which can be 15 days. And again, I see that bargained down quite often to 10. And 10, remember now, you have 10 or 15 days to inspect. Then you have 5 days to notify the seller of any election that you have for them to address defective items. And then the seller has 10 days, up to 10 days to respond. And then the buyer has another window in there where if the seller responds that they're not going to address all the defective items, or they're not going to give you the credit that you've asked for, then you have the right to within 5 days of receiving the seller's response, you have the right to cancel the contract and get your deposit back. So it's important that you follow these timetables, and it's important that your buyer, if you're working with the buyer, knows exactly what these dates are. And you want to maybe calendar them and also calendar a reminder period of a couple days in advance so that you're not springing this on your buyer. Hey, today is the last day for this or that or the other. You want to have been talking to them a few days before that. So there's a second deposit. One of the benefits of writing a NABOR contract are that the penalty for default for a buyer is deposits made to date, meaning that I often recommend that the buyer put down a modest deposit to start with, 5, 10, 15,000, and then a larger deposit after the end of the due diligence period. Therefore, if the buyer discovers something that just is not palatable to them, their risk is lower than if they put a big deposit down to start with. The interesting thing is in the FAR contract, those rules are off. All deposits are a risk to the buyer from day one of the contract. So not only know your timetables, but know your differences between the two contracts. The other part of this whole thing is your loan. The buyer's using financing and using a financing contingency. In the NABOR contract, obviously the buyer has to make loan commitment, has to make the loan application within a certain period of time, or they can lose their ability to use the financing contingency. So I have had cases where the buyer doesn't apply timely, then gets cold feet and gets a letter from a lender saying, oh, I'm sorry, your debt to equity ratios or debt to income ratios aren't good enough and we can't approve your loan. That won't get it in a NABOR contract. You have to apply for the loan, and if you're not applying timely, then you can lose your ability to get your money back under the financing contingency. So it's important that you follow these timetables, and it's important that hopefully if you use a transaction coordinator, maybe they can help you with some of these deadlines. Maybe they can reach out to your buyer and say, hey, remember, you've got this and that coming up. The financing contingency deadline in the NABOR contract is a date which is changed in its importance, in its importance to because of the fact that now we don't have as much supply. So if a buyer does not waive their financing contingency by the deadline, which can be 45 days after the effective date, it can be 30 days, it can be whatever you specify in the contract. But remember, if you don't waive your contingency and say, okay, my deposit's firm, I'm ready to close, I got my loan approval by that date, or extend it, then you're subject to the seller being able to cancel. And that has not been a big deal when we had lots of inventory and there were lots of fish in the sea. And the seller said, well, the buyer didn't waive the contingency, but I'm gonna hang in there and try to get this closed. Not quite, during the really intense period in 21 and part of 22, sellers were canceling. They were saying, hey, the market's still going up. The buyer didn't waive their contingency. I'm going to cancel and go back on the market. And there was a number of really sad faces on the part of buyers when that happened, because they were saying, well, I don't want to make my deposit firm. I want to go ahead and wait a little longer, and they lost the contract. So a lot of these other deadlines in here are not quite as critical, but remember, in the new contract, the buyer does not apply timely to the association for approval. The buyer can lose their ability to get their deposit back if the association, for some reason, does not approve their application. In many cases, we see the buyer drag their feet. Oh, I'm going to wait till the inspections are over. Oh, I'm going to wait for this. Applications to associations can be very complicated. They generally require a credit check and a criminal background check, and these things take time. And then all these applications have to go to the board for approval. So if you're not on this within 10 days after the effective date of the contract, you can be deemed not to being cooperating and not to being doing your part in the contract. And so closing date comes around and the association says, gee, we just got your application, 6 days ago. We still need another week to 10 days before we can approve your or not approve your application. And, therefore, we wouldn't be able to give you that approval for your closing. And the new contract that took effect December 1st, the buyer can essentially lose their deposit because they didn't apply timely, and they can't, claim, oh, I'm not approved, I need to extend. They have to prove that they applied timely. If there's a delay, in this market, it's a little different than it was hard and fast 6 months ago. So it's possible you can still get an extension on the closing date. It's possible the seller says, well, okay, I'll hang in there with you. But the buyer must be diligent in looking at all these dates. So again, we talked about the inspection items. We talked about the financing contingency. And, the last thing, obviously, remember that 5-day window in a standard contract, that if there's something that goes on in the seller's response, remember, when you submit that notice of buyer's request and seller's response in a normal standard contract, you can ask for the seller to address defective items. You can also ask for a credit. But if you're going to ask for a credit, you have to have estimates from a licensed contractor to substantiate your credit. I had a case a couple of weeks ago where the buyer asked for a $10,000 credit and didn't provide any estimates. And the seller came back and said, I'll give you a $6,000 credit because I think that's closer to what you're talking about for these repairs. And that ended up in, going to a legal dispute because the buyer didn't supply estimates for the seller to look at. The seller came back and said, I think that based on my research, 6,000 is the right amount of credit. And the buyer said, well, I want to cancel. And we said, maybe you're not able to cancel because you didn't. So make sure that when you're doing these tasks, that the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed. The buyer is going to ask a seller for a credit in inspection items. Instead of having the seller address them, the buyer has to have written estimates from licensed contractors to substantiate the credit. So we can look at that form in a minute here, but understand that this timetable is meant to govern what has to be done on what period of time to keep the closing on schedule. Can the parties agree to extend? Sure. But if you're agreeing to extend based on good faith efforts, that's one thing. If you're agreeing to extend based on, oh gee, I forgot to apply to the association, oh gee, I forgot to get estimates, those are things that can cause the contract to derail. Excuse me. And at any rate, a derailed contract does not go to the closing table. So that's not a payday. So it's important that you take these dates to heart and that you follow up and make sure everything's going according to plan. A lot of times your closing agent can help you a great deal if you're in communication with your closing agent, which is one of the reasons why I recommend that the buyer pick the closing agent and pay for title insurance, because the buyer then has an ally in the closing agent to make sure that all of these things are happening, especially instructions about titling, surveys, making sure we receive the survey and that it's correct. So the titling instructions, again, in a NABOR contract is assignable. So therefore the buyer can take title in a trust or an LLC by just notifying the seller that they're going to take title in a different, and theoretically the buyer could assign the contract to another family member or include another family member in the titling instructions. So that's another thing to make sure your buyer understands that if they want to do that, they've got to do that 15 days prior to closing. Can't wait till the day before closing and say, oh gee, I want to take title in a different way. That's not going to help with the closing. The buyer's survey review and objection period ends 5 days prior to closing. So it's important, surveys can take some time to get. In general, the seller can provide you with a survey if they have one. And if it's older, they can provide you with an affidavit of no change. But ultimately, the lender and sometimes the buyer wants to see a new survey with an elevation certificate, so they make sure they know everything about the property, any encroachments, anything that might be an easement, something that they might need to know about for their future plans. So another thing that's really important that I've seen happen more and more is the condo homeowners association estoppel. Okay, this is a statement from the association to the closing agent saying the seller doesn't owe any money to the association and confirming the monthly assessments that the buyer will be taking over at closing. Generally, the next quarter or the next month's dues are being collected at closing for the buyer to pay. So they're collected in advance. But if there's any kind of a special assessment that has not been disclosed, but is on the association's books, it will show up in that estoppel. So I've had people say, well, there's an assessment that the seller didn't bother to tell the buyer about, but they knew about or should have known about. And I say, well, did you look at the estoppel? The estoppel will generally say if there's any kind of special additional assessment being collected. Nice shot, Jeff. Beautiful. Anyhow, that should show up in the estoppel. Okay. Again, the buyer's walkthrough is, to me, the most important period of time for the buyer, because then the buyer has a chance to go into the residence, make sure all the repairs are done, make sure that if there's furniture or possessions that should have been removed, that they're removed, and make sure that everything's clean and broom swept and ready for them to occupy. And oftentimes at the walkthrough, you open the garage and still a bunch of stuff there. So you want to make sure you always have your buyer do a walkthrough. And also remember that your E&O doesn't cover you for you doing it yourself, too much liability. If you miss something, if there's possessions that are supposed to have been left by the seller, and if there's an inventory, hopefully you have an inventory handy, and you can say, okay, there's this, and this. But wait a minute, we're missing this. That's the time for you to say, hold on. This is a problem that the seller has not left what they said they were going to leave. Therefore, we want them to either bring it back or give us a credit. So the walkthrough inspection is one of the most critical times in the entire contract for both buyer and seller, but primarily for the buyer to make sure they're getting what they're paying for. All the inventory items are there. If there's seller furniture that needed to be cleaned out, seller possessions that need to be gone before closing, everything's broom swept condition is the standard for turning over a property from a buyer to a seller. Okay, it doesn't mean professionally cleaned and spit shined. It means broom swept condition, neat and clean and ready for the buyer to move in. So that's your ability for your buyer to determine that, and if there's a problem, to ask the seller to address it prior to taking possession. Once they've taken possession, it's very difficult to go back and say, oh, by the way, oh, we missed this. Oh, by the way, we missed. That's not a great time to be doing that after closing. So that walkthrough inspection is really a critical time. I think as an agent, it's a good idea for you to attend that. If there's an inventory, to make sure that the buyer compares all the things that are supposed to be on that inventory to what's there, and make sure everything's is there. And it's not unusual for it not to be there. It's not unusual for the seller to have mistakenly taken the curtain rods or something like that, and they're supposed to be there. Well, now the seller has an obligation to provide a credit or bring the curtain rods back, or something like that. So that's really a key time. I can't stress enough that the buyer should be there. If there's repairs that have been done that are the responsibility of the seller, then good idea to bring your inspector back. You're not a judge of whether the repair was done properly by a licensed contractor. So you should always, usually an inspector for $100 or $150 will come back and check your repairs to make sure that they're all done properly, which is really important, because how do you know that the repair was done properly? The inspector can check it and say, yep, this has been fixed, it's fixed to my satisfaction, and you're good to go. So it's well worth it to schedule your inspector to come back with you to the walkthrough to make sure that the everything's been done properly. You can't tell things with a naked eye. I mean, I'll share a quick war story with you. I was an agent and was selling a second floor condo, and when we did the inspection, we noticed in the hall closet as you first came in the door, but there was quite a bit of moisture on the floor and in the molding, and the inspector did a moisture test and noticed that there was positive test for moisture. So when we went back for the walkthrough inspection, we brought our inspector. She was very good. And she went into that closet and said, all they've done is to caulk around the molding and around the floor. This is still testing positive for moisture. Well, right behind that closet was the shower. And the shower pan was leaking into the closet. And the seller's response to that was, we didn't say that the shower pan was leaking. We said, fix the moisture. So the seller's response to that was, I'll just throw a bunch of caulk in here. They'll never notice it. Well, $10,000 later, we escrowed the money at closing to replace the shower pan and retile the shower. And that was a huge difference. What if we had said, oh, that looks good to me, caulked it in there. And then a month or two later, we have a flood that goes down to our neighbor down below because the shower pan overflowed. So just an example, a war story, if you will, of why you should bring your inspector to the walkthrough. Okay, so it's kind of the end of my my class for today. Talking to you about all the steps from contract to close. I will bring up one thing for you just to get a I go through a document that I think is kind of important. Let me just bring that up real quick here. Back here, go to NABOR, go to inspection items. Here we go. And we'll do all righty then. Let's see if we can share that with you. Excuse me. So we've added some lines in red here, in red ink, for the number of people that try to use this form with an as-is contract. You can't do it. It doesn't mean anything. The language doesn't match up with the as-is contract. So please, if you've ever used this before or thought about using it, please don't. It's meant to be accompany a standard contract showing the buyer's request to the seller for what they deem to be defective. So notice this form is the list of systems and equipment that are defective by the definition of the contract. If there's radon, if there's WDO, if there's toxic or pathogenic molds, or unpermitted improvements. These are all areas that are covered by the contract, defined in detail as to what constitutes a defective item, or an open permit, or toxic or pathogenic mold, or active wood destroying organisms, or radon above 4.0. Don't have too much in the way of lead-based paint in this market, but it still exists. It's still covered by the inspection report. So here's the buyer's election, okay? The buyer can say, I want a credit of X thousand. Now notice this verbiage here, which is equivalent to the estimated cost of remedial action for the identified defective items as evidenced by the attached written estimates issued to buyer by parties appropriately licensed to perform. So if your buyer just puts $10,000 in there and sends it in, what is it? The seller is like, well, where'd you get that number from? Oh, it just sounded good. No, it has to be justified if you're going to ask for a credit. Now you can ask the seller to perform remedial action with respect to the identified defective inspection items. All right. So we've spent a lot of time defining in the contract what is a defective item. All right. So now we want to ask the seller to take remedial action, or maybe we have a radon mitigation that we want a credit for, but we want the seller to fix a number of defects that are readily fixable between now and the closing date. And the buyer is going to sign that and submit it to the seller. And there's a companion document here that, see if I can find it real quick. There it is. There's a companion document here that I recommend you use, that you now remember. Now you must supply, when you're submitting this, you must supply the entire inspection report. Okay. You can't just supply the summary pages that the inspector puts up front with their findings. You want to submit the entire report with any photographs. Okay. And buyer should not request remedial action for a credit in what's cosmetic. And I would say the majority of buyers say, look, I'm paying a lot of money for this house. I want it all fixed. The seller has the ability, now that I've identified where it is on the inspection report and what it is, the seller can go through there, and if it's like re-grout the bottom of the shower, nope, grout is missing, grout, cracked tiles, not a defective item, normal wear and tear. So the seller can then identify what you've asked them to repair, and they can certainly cross out anything that they deem to be cosmetic from the contract. So this is a handy little thing to list out everything you want and then submit that along with the attached form to the seller. All right. And this isn't something you can do in 5 minutes. This is a time-consuming part where you look at the inspection report, you get with the buyer, you talk to the buyer about what it is that you're really concerned about. And to me, this is a key moment in the contract where requesting a lot of small nitpicking things that are cosmetic or not very important can create a adversary situation with your seller. So it's a good time for you to get with your buyer, review the situation, and submit those things that are really important. And submit them with a copy of the inspection report and submit them in good faith. Then you have a good chance that the seller will say, okay, well, I agree, these things need to be fixed and I'm going to fix them. Or your estimate for a credit seems fair to me. I've checked it with one of my contractors. I'll give you the credit. So when the seller responds, now, if you're on the seller side, you want to make sure that if in all cases, the seller tries to check box A. Box A says, I accept your request as to defective items only, but not to cosmetic conditions or other inspection items that are not considered defective. So if I check box A as a seller and sign it, I can't, then I send this back to the buyer can't say, oh, well, I cancel. If the seller says, look, I'm going to counter this, I'm going to reject it or I'm going to counter it. Now you notice it says on the next line, if seller responds with B or C as to any defective inspection items, buyer may terminate this contract not later than 5 days. So you got to be careful with your seller's response here. In many cases, the sellers will agree to address defective items or provide an appropriate credit because they want to sell. They may not want to take on the task of repairing these items or bringing in contractors to do them. So they may just say, okay, I'll give a credit. And if they agree to the credit amount and there's no discussion and the contract proceeds and it goes to closing. There's not an escape hatch in there where the buyer can say, oh, I don't think your credit's appropriate, I'm out. So you want to try, if at all possible, working on the seller side, you want to try to live within box A, that I accept your request as to defective inspection items. So, any questions or comments on that? Very important part of this contract and very important to know how to use this form and also remember never to use it for an as-is contract. All right. So I don't really have anything else to cover today. I'll give you back 20 minutes of your life. Unless you have any questions or comments. We will not have a class next Monday. That's the day after Christmas and the office will be closed, but I want to take this time from Broker Jeff to you and all your families to wish you wonderful holidays and enjoy your time with your family. And thanks for your participation today. God bless you. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeff. Happy holidays.
Thank you,
Thanks, Jeff.
Jeff.
Hey, Jeff, I have one question, if you have a second.
Absolutely.
Is there any reason to waive the financing contingency prior to the deadline specified in the contract? So let's say the buyer is already approved, but it's a 45-day contingency period. To protect the buyer, should we wait to that 45-day period, or is there any benefit to waiving it earlier if they're comfortable with the financing?
No, that's a good question. I mean, the financing contingency period is there for the protection of the buyer. But if you have a clear to close, the lender says there's nothing, the appraisal's good, everything looks good. There's no, I mean, obviously, maybe you want to move the closing date up at that point. If, you know, maybe the seller's okay with closing early, everything's already done. So you can explore that option. Other than that, I don't know what can happen if you've already got the appraisal, the underwriting is done. They're just basically saying you're good. Then go ahead and waive the contingency and see if you can close early, or, you know, it gives the seller additional confirmation that you're ready to go. They can hire a moving van or do whatever they have to do, especially if that date is close to the closing date. Now, you know, normally I like to see the financing contingency date be a week or 10 days ahead of the closing date, so the seller has positive confirmation that they can go ahead and move or go to a storage unit or whatever their plans are for vacating. You like to give them a little bit of time, but many times it's close. If not, I've seen it be the same. So again, I think your question depends on how close is the closing date to the financing contingency date, and is the lender waiting for any type of information that, you know, they can't say, well, we can issue you a clear to close. That's for the protection of your buyer. But other than that, I think it's circumstantial. And I think it has to do with how long the period of time is between financing contingency waiver and the closing date.
All right, thank you.
I mean, you know, I don't know that there's a great answer, perfect answer to that, other than it's circumstantial. Does the buyer want to close early? Does the seller want to close early? Is there enough time between the financing contingency date and the closing date that the seller can make plans to move, confirm everything? Although those are all factors in there. But if there's a couple week period between the financing contingency date and the closing date, then wait till the date, I guess, would be fine.
All right, thanks, Jeff.
Can I help you in any way? I mean,
It did, yes, thanks.
circumstantial there, so. Okay, everybody, happy holidays, Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, and have a great time with your families. Take care. Thank you.
Jeff,
Merry
you too.
Christmas. Thank you.